Welcome back. I'm Zinati Kuma. You are still watching the Future of Education Summit 2020. It is indeed a pertinent discussion this year, education in 2020. Godfrey mentioned earlier on that the UN says 463 million school learners were unable to access education when COVID-19 struck. Now, before we go into the next panel discussion, we're going to be hearing from a remarkable future leader in celebration of Children's Day on the 7th of November. UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador David Beckham interviewed South African techno girl Sibabazo Nchebe about her experiences as a girl in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, also commonly known as STEM. Let's take a look.
I currently reside in a township at the northeast of Johannesburg called Ivory Park in an informal settlement with my family of 4. I'm currently doing science stream, and when I grow up, or when I'm done studying, I would like to become a biomedical engineer. And that is so because I love drawing and I also love medicine and engineering.
When I heard about the Techno Girl program, I thought it was just so amazing and so inspiring. I'm so interested to hear someone of your age talk the way you talk, and also are so inspiring already about what you want to do and what you want to achieve in the future. I want to hear more.
Okay, so let me tell you first about the Technical program. So it is a program for young girls. It encourages them to study careers in STEM. So from there, Technical was able to help me find my path. They widened my career choices. They taught me a lot of skills as well. That's why I'm now sure of what I want to become, and I'm working so hard to achieve my dream.
What reaction do you get when you tell people that you work in science and how interested you are about science?
Every time we speak about STEM-related careers, not everybody believes you're going to eventually become that, and that's what I'm actually trying to overcome. I'm trying to overcome the challenges that society has put for girls out there, that science is only for boys or for males rather than girls.
How have you managed to continue your education and work?
COVID-19 has affected me really negatively as well, because I remember I tested positive for a virus a while back after opening schools. So I had to skip 2 full weeks from school to recover. And in that 2 weeks, I missed out on a lot of work. And now when I returned back to school, I had to catch up on schoolwork. And then I also had to move along and learn what other kids were learning. That was a really tough time for me, I'm not gonna lie. But thankfully, I had the laptop that I got from the company I had job shadowed at with the Techno Girls. And then I was able to watch some YouTube videos, to learn a lot of things. I had PDFs on the laptop. I was able to actually teach myself and be able to also pass the exam at the same time. And I'm really thankful for that.
So lovely to talk to you, and good luck with everything. I'm looking forward to seeing what you achieve in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sibabazo. With the UN predicting that millions of children are at risk of dropping out of school, it is indeed inspiring to hear those strong words. Now, we do know that unemployment is a crisis in Africa. Just in South Africa alone, in the third quarter, unemployment increased to 43%. And with that, there are new business models in the world of work. And there are entrepreneurs that are tapping into that market to prepare students for the future and innovation. Now, our next panel discussion is on innovations in educational entrepreneurship. Godfrey Mutizwa is back with us for this conversation.
Thank you, Zinati. You can see we are also educating, we are teaching, you are looking at the future presenter right there. Now, in Africa, we know that our governments spend a lot of money on education. In fact, in some cases, on a per capita basis, we spend more than some Western governments. South Africa indeed spends more than Germany and the US, though the outcomes do not always reflect that. So I'm asking the question, do we need private money in education? And I suggest that we do. The question then becomes, where do we need it? And how do we use it? And importantly, in COVID times, do the business models change? Here are my panelists.
Professor Gary Martin Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of Management, Western Australia. Dean McCaubrey, founder of My Social Life. Omar Faruqi, founder and president of Coded Minds. John Foster-Pedley, Dean of Henley Business School.
And it is John that we begin with. John, welcome and thank you. I thought I would just give a little description of who you are so people understand when you speak where you come from. John is a director, strategist, activist, speaker, writer, like me, educator, marketer, 10 years as a dean, director, marketing director, and builder of Henley Business School Africa. Thank you for joining us and thank you for bringing in your insights. Now, you guys have been on the continent for a number of years. So I want your perspective on the entrepreneur and private money in education debate on the African continent in COVID times. Asking a silly question, do we need it?
Oh, yes. Hi, Godfrey. Hi, everybody else. Very nice to meet you and be on a panel with you. Impressive people. Absolutely, we do. And I can't think of a better time to start putting, private money into this. There's a real challenge here because the institutions of education are doing their best, but they're just not delivering the skills we need. 45% of South Africans, according to an OECD report, are not skilled for the current economy, let alone for a COVID recovery, and one that needs to diversify and add multiple high-tech sectors and creative sectors to the economy. So we've got a real problem here. So I'm keen that private money comes in, invests in schools, sets up new private education and PPPs as well, and also provides digital education as well with new media and new methods to the population as a whole, although we have to be very careful about the digital divide. So I can think of no better time for us to be imaginative in our business models and reframe education and go in there all guns blazing in a new frontier of education in Africa.
Indeed, and I'm going to ask the same blended question. It's a word that came into our lexicon here at CNBC Africa today. We're going to use it and use it and use it and use it. Professor Gary Martin, I want your thoughts as well on that, the role of private money in education in Africa in these times.
Well, I think that we can always do with more money in an education system, but I think before we actually start to invest, we need to know what we're investing in. And I think this is a time where we need to reconsider exactly what happens in universities and the types of universities that are around. I don't think anybody would want to invest in a private sense, unless they knew full well what they were actually investing. So there's a big piece of work to be done around what universities might look like before that investment takes place. I think in Australia, because of COVID, if I use that as an example, I think there are task force all around Australia in universities trying to reimagine or imagine what universities might look like. Once that's set and once we have some very clear ideas, I think that's when investment takes place, whether that's from the government or from private enterprise.
Educate me a little bit about the Australian education landscape. What are the percentages in terms of that coming from the state and private money in education? I don't know whether you want to restrict it to higher education or just education as a whole.
I think I'd take higher education. At the moment, that's a very, very interesting question because the Australian university sector has been very reliant on international students. So it varies from university to university, but there are some universities in Australia that derive maybe 40% of their revenue from international students. And of course, with the borders closed, that changes things fairly significantly. The remainder of the funding, if it's not coming from international revenue, does come from government, but also students in Australia make a contribution. So our domestic students make a contribution towards their education.
Sure. Omar, let me come to you. And I'm going to add a little addition to the initial question about the role of private money in education and ask, what role does it play?
Okay, so the problem is that public-private partnerships is something that I think we all need to work towards. I mean, governments need to be opening up toward the private sector. Private sector is always going to be flexible. It's going to be faster. Governments are always a little bit slower. Unfortunately, there's always all these other insinuating factors that we all know about that, you know, in the frontier markets that are there. Simple answer is yes, of course, private money, private sector money is very, very important. More importantly, I think, is what can the government bring to the table, and in this partnership. And I actually believe that from an infrastructure perspective, government has this, should play a role in bringing the actual infrastructure into the partnership. Private sector actually, I don't think even needs the money from the government. They need the infrastructure. They need the kind of a policy level influence, and the private sector's money will flow right into the world.
You're making me think of another question to add to the debate today that I had not anticipated, and that is whether actually we need more private money than government money in education, because we know the private sector is more efficient. And when you look at the outcomes in terms of some of the greatest companies that have been created in the world, they have come from the private sector. So maybe there's a need for a rethink there. But let's get the thoughts of our last contributor to our debate today. That's Dean Makobri. He's founder of My Social Life. Dean?
Thank you. Thanks, Godfrey. And also very nice to be here with these panelists. I think, yeah, of course, everybody else on the panel has said it, that it is important to get private sector money, and it is extremely beneficial to have private-public partnerships. But for me, what we do at My Social Life is we are actually on the ground with students in schools, teaching them digital life skills. Okay, so we are actually the instructors of these kids about what they need to learn. And when you're at the coalface with them, the game has changed, because they received these devices, the smartphone in 2007, the tablet in 2010, at around about the same time as adults. And what they've been doing is they've been using these devices, they're enamored by them, but they've kind of jumped on this train and just exploded out into the internet. And what we need to understand is that they have this incredible capacity and capability with technology, but they often lack the critical thinking skills, the emotional maturity. They don't understand too much about privacy, cybersecurity threats. These are all the things that we teach them. So my point is that whichever money we get, I think the most important thing we need to do is to review whatever curriculum we create in terms of digital life skills. We need to do it with a certain level of humility about where these teens, these preteens, these university or varsity students are. And we're going to need to understand this new language, their needs, the pedagogy, the type of method that they're going to be taught by. Like, the game has radically changed. And the most interesting thing for me is engagement, is that these kids can tune out super quickly with the nature of their consumption of media. And so it needs to be really entertaining. We're talking about, I heard Kathy saying, we've got these outdated curricula in terms of some of the subjects. We need to be careful that when we step into the new curricula, that we come at it with some energy and some dynamism, that we understand the new landscape of pedagogy. So because we're at the coalface with these kids.
For sure. In the previous panel that we had, where we talked broadly about the education sector, in particular higher education in these changed times, one of the points that was made by one of the professors was that even the universities themselves need to undo the ways in which they've been doing things, and in order to try and adapt. Which brings me to the next point I wanted us to discuss, which is the kind of models that we take into these COVID times. Do we change where we were? Do we stay where we are? Dangerous stuff, the word to use in these times where everything is changing every single day. I want to begin again the round, and so I'm coming to you, John.
Well, it's a fascinating question, isn't it? We're supposed to be educators. Educators, apart from being analytic and ponderous and full of gravitas, should be creative and energizers. They should build motivation and confidence in people. And we should think ourselves, how can we create? So when you're looking at this medium now, we're looking at a two-dimensional screen. How much do we consume on a day-to-day basis that is not linear, that's not analytical, and that's not academic? everything. It's full of emotion. It's full of engagement. It's full of life. And so what we need to do as educators is pull in the skills that you would use, Godfrey, and many others, to make these things come to life and change the rhythm of education. The content of what we teach is easily accessible largely, but the interpretation and the application of it, the golden jewels that make people be able to use this so they can build businesses and build lives, those are things that need to be fed into the education by great education designers. So I was super impressed by listening to the other speakers there about all the work they're doing. We've got a value chain building here of innovation around digital that I think we have to take on. We can't think digital or everything's digital. How do we infuse that with learning, engagement, confidence, and progress?
Yeah, and the challenge for the private sector is that, of course, your school, your university has to offer better than the state school. So you almost always under pressure to ensure that you are very quick to adapt and make sure that you are relevant. Let me get the thoughts of Dean.
Yes, I think I touched on it before. For me, the most important thing, part of what we teach, what we do is almost like popular culture and social media. We use that as the doorway to show them a whole load of other doors. And so we literally teach them about apps like Among Us, Instagram, TikTok, Yubo, Reels. We talk to them about that, and we teach them a number of different lessons. So we teach them about digital identity, critical thinking, privacy, security, sexuality online, reputation and digital footprint, mind health. And I think when you speak to them about that, what you really notice, and I mentioned it before, was that we forget what it's like for these kids, for these teens and these adolescents, that their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed. And so we need to kind of take ourselves back and work out what can we teach them? How will they consume it? How will it be absorbed and impacted? Because it's easy to talk about the future of work, but we need to understand the future workers.
Dean, in part what you are saying is my question on the changing models for making sure that you remain relevant in this world is redundant, because you are saying you're constantly changing, evolving, and re-examining every single thing that you do, be it content, be it interpretation, being the teachers and the models that they use.
100%. It is moving so quickly. And of course, I do get that curricula will be concrete to a certain degree. What I'm saying is their world isn't concrete. It's utterly fluid. It's ever evolving. The apps are changing all the time. What we talked to them about 6 months ago, we're not talking to them about it now. And but ultimately what they do need is they need foundational skills. There's a gentleman named Kubus from the Education Association, Odessa, and he said this. He said, you know, once upon a time, we used to teach kids how to hold a pencil, and they had to hold it in a certain way with a certain dexterity. But if, for example, they held it like this, then the output wouldn't be correct. The output would be perhaps even a little bit redundant. And then he said, well, so what are we doing here? Have we taught them that? Have we taught them how to navigate this, how to set up their settings, how to explore, how to excel? At the moment, what we've done is, as I said, we've fallen into it. So we need to go back a bit. We need to put in a foundational layer of digital soft skills to combine with these incredible hard skills that, for example, Omar is teaching. Together, Omar's work and my work could really sing, as an example.
Omar, do you want to come in? And I also want the thoughts of Professor Martin.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Dean makes a valuable point, but I come back to policy again. I mean, you know, as long as university is still going to be 4 years long and we're going to be about tests and exams, the same thing, and it's going to be the same theory that students have to learn, all these amazing 21st century skills that, you know, Dean or myself and Coded Minds were trying to teach won't matter, because the parents will still look at it as, you know, my child still has to pass an exam, right? And he still has to do science and math and chemistry and biology, all of which is freely available on the internet, but we still got to pay for it for some strange reason. So I think we need to really re-examine from a top-down policy perspective, which is why governments need to, or I should say, regulators need to have a real hard look at themselves, look at the education model, you know, what's relevant for the future skills. You know, it's no more textbooks or pencils or pens, just like Dean said. It's more about digital literacy, more about, a more relatively content that is a lot more relatable, to the kids of the future, the adults of the future, I should say.
Yeah, Omar, you're speaking to an old guy. I'm sure you can see I've been around a little bit. So I remember when we were in school, I think it was primary school, you got a prize if you had the best handwriting. Now you're telling us those
Correct.
things are redundant. Well, all right, I'll accept it. Professor Martin, your thoughts?
Yes, look, I agree with the other panelists in terms of talking about we need to revisit what we're teaching. But I think equally as important is the very issue of how we teach it. And obviously, universities all around the world are trying to grapple with that digital experience and trying to produce the best digital experience that they can for their students. And there's a good reason for that, because if I was in South Africa, for example, because of the rise of digital education, there's no reason why I have to study in South Africa anymore. I could actually do my degree virtually in any country of the world. That's any country of the world. So students that were once aligned with South African universities can now go and experience the same thing at any university in the world. Similarly, in Perth, Western Australia, where I am, our students can come and study in South Africa or the US or the UK without getting on the plane. So while COVID might have closed the borders, it's certainly opened up international education in a different sense. And of course, universities have to scramble around to come up with the best digital or virtual experience for students worldwide.
Sure, sure. I can see Professor Martin is speaking a little to his book right there, but your point is very well made. I want also to say at this point that we're going to be taking questions from people who are watching, I'm hoping from around the world, in a short while. But I wanted to begin with you, Professor Martin, before we move on to the others and get their thoughts as well on the role of regulation, and whether you, gentlemen, in the private sector, see regulators being able to keep pace with the kind of speed that we are seeing things change when you look around the world in terms of the question of education. Professor Martin, your thoughts, and then we get through everybody.
Yes, so the regulation systems that are across universities, I think what we need to make sure is that they're not or they don't overburden universities, because as soon as we spend time just trying to comply, then we have, a serious part of our workforce moving into a compliance mode and not focused on actually producing excellent curriculum and a great student experience. And I think in the past, perhaps we've gone too far with compliance issues. I think there's a movement now across the world to not have to vary from one model or one size fits all type of model when it comes to compliance. So those that are demonstrating, for example, that they're high quality in everything they do, then the compliance issues in terms of inspections and other related compliance issues are different for those organisations. For those where there have been a lot of complaints, there's been some quality issues and so on. So I think while compliance is very important, we shouldn't focus purely on that. We should be spending a lot of time in university sectors on developing the very best curriculum and experience and injecting our resources into that.
John, Omar, Din, I want all of you to come in that order.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, so I think it's a real shift from where they are, today, where they were in the past, and where we should be looking at in the future. And it's basically the private sector, which already is doing a lot of amazing things. It's just that unfortunately, it's not recognized by the higher education authorities or the secondary level education authorities, because they're still considered kind of vocational subjects. They're not really considered mainstream subjects where the degree or a four-year degree is recognizable. So I think that there needs to be a complete partnership and a complete link together of how things are in the future. Because I mean, look at Facebook or look at Tesla. I mean, they don't require an MBA or they don't require a bachelor's degree anymore. right? They just want the relevant skills there. And that's a big deal. That's a big shift. I mean, that's also a role that corporates can play.
Yeah, it's a big deal because it makes my job as a parent very difficult. If my sons heard about that, I'm telling you, there would be pandemonium in my home. John?
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, you have to feel for the regulators. You know, there are people who are decent people, try to do a great job. They're in institutions. Institutions have lag. Life's rapidly moving and changing. They become politicized. They have established ways of doing things. They're not agile. But the world is, and it's moving too fast. And then you've got people who don't care about qualifications anymore. You've got industry sectors that say, you teach us that, we'll employ them. So what's the point of these qualifications? And then you've got international schools that are just going, or education is just cutting across, like Gary said, all the national regulators. Why do you worry about South African or Australian regulation when you can go online and do it here? And so you've got to, so what regulators have to do is adapt quickly because they have a purpose, they're providing quality. But what we need to do as educators is not rail at them and not use them as a dartboard for to put all our venom and frustration on, to be able to help them. So we have to create a new form of regulation, or maybe we have blockchain qualifications that are regulated by bodies of universities or other people, where you have a ledger of pieces that make up credibility. And the other thing that's happening, we have credentializing programs. And so a lot of the online people credentialize rather than qualify. And that's really valid. And it's also agile, fast, and adept, you know, for the changes. So the whole landscape's changing. Let's help the regulators evolve, and let's think of global regulation or accreditation rather than national anymore, because that'll help all of us.
Interesting thought right there. And I think it can be done because we're already seeing on the African continent, for instance, the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, where there is standardization on things like quality of goods. There are rules on rules of origin in terms of the components that go into making the product, etc., etc. So you can arrive at a common standard, and that, as you are saying, will certainly push up the speed of transformation. Do you want to come in, Dean?
You know, I think John did such an insanely good job there. He really did. I mean, as he was speaking, I think I was even murmuring. It really is. What he said is incredibly true. The only piece that I would add is that we mustn't overlook the divide, the rich poor divide, the technological and the skills divide, and we mustn't overlook this generational divide, because what the regulators need, that's what I was saying, that's what I thought was great about what John said, is that you actually have to have some empathy. We have to provide solutions. We have to assist them, because how do they try and manage this kind of explosive or this seismic change with respect to people moving on to devices, trying to connect people, trying to make things compliant and regulated when there's a whole load of new industries and new skills? They're going to need experts that understand the landscape, the language, the what's happening in the environment. And I think they're going to really have to reach out to people, and we're going to have to come together.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the previous panel where we were chatting as well about some of the key things that are required to ensure that we're able to deliver quality education. And we came up with a little phrase wherein we said data is a human right, and it should be added to the UN sort of requirements that are required out of every government, in the same way that we talk about water, in the same way that we talk about power. And I'm going to go a little further here and ask you, and I know in part I'm speaking to the converted here, should governments make it a requirement for a university to set up, to have data as part of the basic requirements that are provided? And you guys in the private sector are part of the solution in terms of the provision of that data and the means to access and use that data. I'm beginning with you, Dean, before we move around again. And then after that, we're taking questions.
I actually do think so. But what should be twinned with that, and it doesn't matter what age it is there should be some type of digital life skills certification or training, some type of induction at different levels and different stages that do look at what it will be like to study online and to engage online. Because we haven't really touched on what we do see, even just with teens and pre-teens at the moment, in terms of racism, hacking, sextortion, all sorts of crazy things. If we're going to be putting people into academic institutions and we're going to be connecting them, we need to do this. We need to help them with how to hold these devices just as we start to connect them. We're going to connect them, then we're going to say to them, just go. But we are assuming so much about that they would take this device and use it for good. It is primarily being used for socializing and entertainment, and of course for learning. But in the earlier years, in the preteens and in the teens, they're just completely all consumed and absorbed by that. And nobody has said to them, hey, there's a whole load of doors here. There's a door in which you can use it for learning. There's a door here which you can use it for good, where you can do something for charity. There's a door here which you can use for TikTok dancing. That's great. But there's a lot of doors, and we've got to show them all the doors, and we've got to show them what's behind them, and we've got to show them how to be responsible citizens once they start that journey.
Professor Martin? Martin, are you there?
Was that a question for me?
I'm asking you the same question that I've just asked Dean, and this is the issue around making sure that in terms of setting up a school, should it be a requirement that data is available as a basic tool to get to educate learners?
Well, I couldn't hear if that was for me, but I'm going to, sorry if I cut in, but I'll just answer that. Yes, data should be free, obviously, but who gives the data is the issue. Because if you're living in a society where you've got oligopolies and inflated data prices, etc., you've got a significant issue about telling the universities to supply that. Actually, governments and private enterprise should do that as well. And maybe we'll have satellites who will do it. But I was quite struck when I was listening to Dean there, because all those issues he's talking about kids growing up are the same for executives. That only 10% of people in South Africa get to do degrees. And that leaves 90% without. And the sort of level 5 programs, which are sort of the first year of degree, when we do that, the average age of that is 37. We've got a generation of people who didn't get access to education, who are enormously smart, who are now doing education later in life, and we're feeding them back into it. It's got to be practical education. We need to teach them how to hold the pencil. I'm going to borrow that metaphor. It's great. Because they're the ones who are going to transform the economy, who are working already. So I think we should provide free data. I think we are doing it ourselves as much as we can, but it's a collective endeavor.
Professor Martin?
Look, without question, there should be free data for students. I mean, we're not going to move anywhere fast at all. If we think about what a university education might look like in 10 years' time, it will be reliant on data, and it'll be an anywhere, anytime type of educational experience. So, if you are within an educational setting, the requirement to have data will be there. And of course, if you're operating outside of it, then you're going to provide it yourself ultimately, because there won't be, I don't think in 10 years' time, the constraints and some of the structures that we actually have in place. You think about, maybe a Netflix, a streaming service, you watch it anytime, anywhere you are. I have to say that that's probably where we're headed in 10, 15 years, even perhaps less, with education. It will be on your phone, on your laptop, wherever you are. You won't have to start a semester one when the university says. You can start anytime, and you'll hand in assignments and assessments anytime. The whole world is going to change. So data is a minimum requirement.
Absolutely. I agree with you. So, as I promised, we are going to go to questions, and there are a few that have already come in. And one of them, in fact, the first question that I'm going to ask actually has touched on something that was raised by one of you, which I was going to touch on, which is the issue of cost. But let me give it to our questioner. Now, can someone comment on the issue of private sector money in education as CSI or as business? For business, what scope exists in the market for high-priced education in a context demanding for lower fee or free education? That comes from Kurai Chitima. Since he hasn't allocated who's going to answer the question, I'm going to throw it open and ask anyone to come in if anyone is interested in answering that one.
Godfrey.
Yeah,
Two voices.
Go ahead, Gary. Go ahead.
Thank you, Godfrey. Again, I don't think that private enterprise will invest in universities at the moment anyway, to any larger extent that they may or may not be doing, because it's very unclear where they're going to go. So again, it comes back to the question, even if it is a CSR type arrangement, it's a support type of mechanism for a university. Companies still want to know what they're investing in. And I think we're going to be seeing things like more specialist universities, more universities that are experience only rather than formal classes, more universities that are online only universities. We're even going to be looking at having things like budget universities and merged universities and things like advanced vocational schools. You can already see the signs of some of these things in some countries. So again, it's a matter of places determining exactly what sort of experience they're going to provide. And when that resonates with industry, that's when the funding will flow.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah. So affordability and accessibility are the two main issues in education. That's what I personally believe globally, let alone in Africa or some of the other developing nations. From an affordability perspective, there's a great question. Look, I'm an ex-investment banker. I spent 19 years as an investment banker. I did a lot of M&A in the education sector, so I know exactly the margins that take place in the education sector. And guess what? It's an amazing business, right? And so from an affordability perspective, we've launched a whole curricula, a whole secondary level education for only $100, and it's still commercial. That's very, very important. And we've done that by radically kind of disrupting the price point and giving the access to those who couldn't afford private level, the so-called private level education. We've given that at a sort of a public level price point. And that can only happen if there's a buy-in from stakeholders. And we, in certain countries, we've received that, and that's why we've grown to over 1 million students today on our platform and growing further. And I think that is what needs to happen in Africa as well. There needs to be a reinvention of price point.
I've got a controversial question. Even I are saying it's a controversial question. Can we trust the private sector to provide education in the same way that we trust the private sector to provide food, with the government playing the regulatory role? Discuss.
Well, I'll chip in on that. Let's think about this for a moment. The biggest problem most organizations have is talent, getting the right people, getting the quality of people you want. How do you make people loyal to you? You give them education. If you give somebody education, they are your friends for life. So if you want to have a business model for sponsoring education, cut out some of your advertising and headhunt search budgets and chuck it into education and bursaries and scholarships. You're going to have a bunch of people who will be dying to work for you. And I think we just need to evolve business models. Omar was talking how he was in M&As and building business models. Business model innovation is where the big bang for the buck is on any startup. And I think we have to think about that in education now. How are we going to innovate this whole game we're playing in? So the private sector really is pumping money in, because it'll pay off for them. There's no question. And why, anyway, should we worry about businesses giving the wrong sort of education? As long as you get a consortium of business who are defining the skills they need and then building education that provides those needs. You're worried about the cowboys. I'm worried about not getting the skills into the economy.
For sure. Because when you think about it, across the African continent, you look at education in the private sector and education in the public sector, there's a vast gap in many schools. And I think it's something that's seriously worth considering. Anyone else want to come in, or can I move on to the next question? Any hand up? No one is going to take that one up. Guys, come on. Don't be afraid of these governments. We can get them to agree to some of these things. All right, let's take a second question. Are the private schools resourced and able to meet the demands of offering evolving education needs. What is the situation with financing for private schools? Bring it wide open as well.
I mean, as far as private education is concerned, I mean, if we talk about traditional schooling, I'm talking about bricks and mortar schooling. They're already kind of stuck in real estate land, right? So I think there needs to be a blended approach to learning in terms of online, offline, and then of course live education as well, or physical classroom education as well. And I think that's where the reinvention of education is going to happen. I mean, and again, those who are stuck in sort of real estate or based out of the real estate of education or campus-based education have to pay back their money and that's why they charge higher fees. That's why they cannot charge lower fees. So the business model of education also needs to be relooked at as well. And that's something that needs to be, again, a public and a private partnership or at least a thought or a roundtable together to be discussed.
I suggested that we could just let the private sector do it and get regulated by the governments. I haven't had any takers on that one.
Can I just say something there? It's really fascinating that we're living in South Africa, which has got the highest Gini coefficient in the world. So more people locked in poverty, excluded from education. This country and many other developing countries cannot viably build an economy unless those people who are smart are given the education they need. And the current institutions aren't doing it. We have to do the $100 thing that Omar's talking about. Behind me, you see a campus. That's our campus. We haven't used this for 8 months, but it's not for students, but it's a wonderful place to generate virtual education. It's a great place to be. It's quiet and private, and we're using it for that. So, there is still a place for bricks and mortar, but not much. How do we get education to the people who are going to build the economy? And we can't have people excluded. So this is the way to do it. Sure. Private schools haven't got the money. We have to find the means to give them that.
Godfrey?
Yes.
I think that the interesting thing here is that we sit at, COVID has forced a lot of things upon a lot of people. And we sit at an interesting point of reflection or self-reflection about where are we? The question is will we stop long enough, because everybody is pivoting and pressured and there's all sorts of problems out there, in order to self-reflect and work out what is the way forward? What is the way forward in terms of funding? Because with the work that we do, we see the way in which some kids that can't even read, they're not confident readers, can use phones and do all sorts of wonderful things with them. And so we've almost been forced, not everybody, people that don't have access to these devices, but that will come over the next decade. But we've been forced into seeing what the opportunity is for education. But my problem is, are we going to do it? Are we going to really redo it? Are we going to unlearn and then go forward with new objectives and new strategies? Or are we just going to kind of tweak it and then keep our fingers crossed that hopefully we'll get through? Because there's been so many promises about 4IR, free iPads, and many promises that we'll be one of the best countries in Africa, South Africa, for example, in terms of the continent. But really, I'm not seeing that much difference with the people that I am engaging with about where we are at that intersection. It takes it's an uncomfortable thing to say. I can tell you that we have been approached by government for our program. But the first question is, I hope you understand there isn't money. And I'm like, wow, that's a weird way to start. And it doesn't really entice me to want to inspire and move people to engage and to change the face of what we can do as a country with 4IR at this junction in which people can pick up these devices with the right foundational skills, look behind the doors and say, I'm going for coding. It's a phenomenal intersection for us. But and the question is will we self-reflect? Will we stop? Yeah. Will we come together? Yeah. And will we chart a new way forward?
So you have spoken to my next couple of points that I wanted us to discuss. One, it's a question around the future. If you had a crystal ball, what would the world of education look like? I want you guys to think about that. And then the second part is on what that might look like in terms of a model. And this goes to another point that we discussed in the first debate, which is the blended model of education that we've seen develop as a result of COVID-19. Though some of you gentlemen have been saying this is something that you've already been doing for years. So think about those 2 points. I'm going to come back and I'll raise them. But let's take another question that's come through from our viewers. Here's the question. It comes from, I think it says it's for Dean. Dean, what are the examples of digital soft skills that you talked about? A very interesting concept it is.
Okay, so I'll give you the examples of what we are currently teaching in schools from grade 4 to grade 12. So we teach digital identity. Who will you be online? What will this look like when you leave varsity? What digital footprint, which is the next thing? What does your reputation look like? If I look for you on social search, under hashtags, under account tags, if I try and Google you, what will I see? Privacy. Do you leave your doors and windows of your digital house wide open for people to just reach in and try and take your passwords or your credit card details? Do you understand external cybersecurity threats? In terms of mind health, are you ready to tap your potential and your performance by being able to do one simple thing, which is to turn it over and turn it off for a moment, be a human being, have a cup of tea, take a walk, do some creativity, whatever it may be, do some exercise. We need to trigger these different things. And you would be absolutely amazed by the way, first of all, by how much our teens and preteens don't know. We conducted an assessment, a Chrisman assessment yesterday. And, the questions that we asked them were so phenomenal about just how much they don't know. They're so savvy, they're so tech savvy online, but that doesn't mean that they know a lot about life and about how to navigate it. So those are the things that we teach. Even, for example, we were talking about, you think about sexuality online, about how things are portrayed online. Like there's so much skin and gesturing, and it's all about like what you have and material possessions. And it actually comes back to your previous question, and I'm going to part with this. What does the future look like? What I would love is that this intersection, this opportunity, provide us not just an opportunity to talk about digital education or technological education, but about being good humans. The world is in a really funny place, and we need to focus on soft skills. Once upon a time, back when I was at school, 20 years ago, it was about IQ. Then it was about EQ. And now DQ should be about IQ meets EQ in a digital world. And that really would excite me to see humans. And I think this generation is very motivated, they're like activists. They're a bit irritated with our generation for what they believe we did to the climate, for example. They're very vocal, but we need to help them harness that. We need to bring that goodness through. We need to show them tech for good.
Yeah, Dean, I want you to Google me. Let me know what you find. And while you were talking, Zinati was busy laughing and saying, "What? Put down the phone? What do you mean? You are making me not be able to breathe. I can't breathe," she was saying through pursed lips here. Professor Martin, I want to come to you because we're going to round up. So I want you to talk to the 2 points that I raised. One, the issue of what that crystal ball looks like when you look at it in terms of the kind of models that will work and what education will look like. And then secondly, that blended model that we discussed in the first part. For you, what would it look like as well? Is it 50-50, 40-60, or 0-100?
Well, as I said, I think it comes down to the time frame that we're looking at. And in 10 years' time, I think we'll be looking at a completely virtual experience, and that will be supplemented by some face-to-face type interactions in a campus setting. But I do think what we're really looking at is, as I said, an anywhere, anytime model. So it's not just about a virtual experience. It's actually enroll anytime, complete anytime, do your degree in a year if you want to instead of 4 years or 3 years. Do your assessments when you want to. It's all about you in a very student-centric, not faculty-driven model. Now, that might be hard to see. But I think that is where we're going ultimately, and we're already seeing signs of enormous flexibility coming into some universities around the world, and students gravitate towards that sort of flexibility. So, I think in the meantime, we're going to continue with a blended type of approach. Depends on safety issues, obviously, but ultimately, I think we're headed for mainly digital type experience with flexibility like we've never seen before.
Omar, Mr. Coding?
Yeah, look, I mean, I dare I say, COVID has been amazing for the world of education. I think it's the catalyst we've all needed. It's the timeout that everyone's needed. So I actually think that, you cannot get rid of real estate. So what do you do with it? I actually think you're going to flip it in the future. What that means is you're going to go to campuses to socialize. You're not going to go to campuses to learn, right? All the learning is going to happen virtually or online, whatever you want to call it. That's number one. Second of all, we say public education and we say private education. I actually think it's going to be none of those, just going to be called education in the future. And it's going to be defined by a price point, right? And second of all, micro-credentialing. I think blockchain is going to be completely disrupting the world of, taking your degree wherever you go, or micro degree or nano degree, whatever you want to call it. So you're not going to have that's going to be the one thing that's going to be transportable, and it's going to be registered with corporates in the future who are going to recognize that degree, and you don't need sort of higher education authorities anymore who will have a new role to play. So I think that's where the world is going to go in the next 10 years.
Dean, again, it's the two sort of points that I raised, but I also want anything else you want to pick up in terms of what the others have said as we wrap up.
Well, I will pick up what the others have said. I think if you look at this dialogue and the sort of people who've been in it, you've had a wonderful insight into different ways of thinking. I mean, I would just wish everyone could listen to this more often. It's been really insightful from everybody. I mean, I've learned a lot. And I believe that you're not educating unless you're learning more than the people you're educating. Otherwise, you're on autopilot. I used to be a pilot for a living. And trust me, you don't want your pilot on autopilot. You want him awake. I think there's a lot here that's really important. Imagine the best store you've been into that's captivating, uplifting, interesting. An Apple store plus a style store plus this, plus that, plus. That's what education needs to look like in the future. You go there and you're uplifted and you're excited. Now, a lot of education isn't about excitement. It's about high stakes. It's about medicine. It's about science. You're making big choices, and you've got to learn a lot of stuff. Some of that stuff can be amplified by AI, obviously around the world. And then think about learning in real life. You don't want people to be making mistakes and taking a long time to make mistakes. You want them to see errors early. You've got to have people understanding the context, capturing it, and then making and seeing it and stopping those things becoming into big problems. So that's about accelerating learning in real life. And it's not just about knowing things, it's about interpretation. The real interpretation is not the 50-page document, it's a 2-page memo or diagram or representation or even a poem that's going to change the way you see things and change your behavior in life. That's real learning. And the other thing is we have to learn for consequences. Now, one of the challenges of the drone generation and the US Army, who are brought up on Grand Theft Auto or whatever it is, you get into a tank or whatever and life's a 2-dimensional game. It's not. We're living real consequences, real world, real climate change, real dissolution of societies, real deaths, real problems. We have to teach people to understand causality and consequences. Now that's where I would say that when you come together, either virtually or in real life, that you start to get a sense of what's going on there, where you start to sense humanity again, that you realize we're living in one world. And that's where you come collectively, you start to feel who we are. We have to make education egalitarian, get rid of the great professor whose pearls of wisdom you wait for. And then instead of dropping pearls, you should drop the grit in people's minds that works on them to build that pearl, like an oyster. That takes time. We're provocateurs, and we need to be, in a sense, held to account for what we teach and not allowed to get off the hook. We as educators have to take accountability.
Absolutely. Keep knocking. Dean, you have the final word.
Yeah, I think that engagement is is really, really key. I think for kids, we need to understand that they will, whatever we teach them, if we teach them digitally, we teach them physically, we teach them blended, the information, they're used to a certain amount of information. There's a lot of immediate gratification in their social lives, on their devices, things where this is where they normally live. This is where there are hours and hours a day spent. And so we need to understand that as their mentors, to what John had just said, as their mentors, we need to be able to help impart wisdom, help them make these connections because they embed memories. We have a neuroscience partner that consults to our program because he explains to us how we create emotion, how we understand what's going on in their brains, how we can reverse neural pathways so that we can get them to actually absorb the lessons and try and change behavior. And that's what we really want, because there is a huge riptide of information, popular culture, social media that is swimming upstream against the purpose or the values of certain people in society. That could be educators, could be government. And look, that sounds like it's just too big to tackle. But if we used the education platform, if we used great mentors, great educators, great methods in order to be able to embed memories, lessons that people remembered, that inspired them, that moved them, then I think that we could see a real difference at this intersection. But we're going to need to self-reflect and come together and go, wow, this is a heavy task, an exciting task, but a big, big task.
Without question, without question. So I learned a lot here. And in the first one, we say data is a human right. And here I am taking IQ, EQ, DQ. Now I know what those mean. But I've also written an equation. It goes something along the lines, private education plus public education is equal to education, and that's education into the future. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And to you who have been listening, thank you very much. And I'm hoping that you have also been able to take away something. Zinati.
Indeed, very interesting times with the growing digitization in the education sector. One interesting point that was brought up is that I can, in South Africa, be studying at university in Australia, but studying virtually. But I'm saying to you, Godfrey, personally, if I were studying at university in Australia, I'd actually fly there, bring on the COVID-19 vaccine.
And I'm saying you will be taking down the rand. Hey, stay at home.
Let's take a short break. We'll be back more with my colleague Fifi Peters on the future of education.